My name is Lydia Carver. I'm 62 years old. That morning, the light over Charleston was so soft, it looked almost kind. It slipped through the shutters of my kitchen and rested on the counter where the coffee pot hissed. I'd already folded the dish towels, watered the plants, and fed the cat before 7. Mornings had always been my rhythm, clean, predictable. A kind of music you could count on when the rest of life refused to stay in tune. The old house creaked as I moved through it. Wood breathing against wood. My late husband, Thomas, built this place 38 years ago, brick by brick. He used to joke that every nail in these walls carried one of his heartbeats after he passed. I kept the house the way it was, his tools still lined up in the shed, his flannel shirts folded in a cedar chest upstairs. I never remarried. Some people thought that made me lonely, but I've never been lonely in a house built with love. That morning, I was making blueberry pancakes for my son, Ethan. He was coming by to pick up a few boxes before his move to Atlanta, the last step before the wedding. The air smelled of coffee and cinnamon. And for a moment, I let myself believe the day would be simple. Then my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "This is Kendra. Just confirming brunch for today. I have a few things we should go over before the rehearsal dinner. No greeting, no Mrs. Carver, just that." I stared at the message, reading between the words, firm, efficient. A tone that reminded me of someone used to giving instructions, not sharing meals. I typed back, "Of course, looking forward to it," and put the phone down before I changed my mind. By 10, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Kendra Hayes standing on my porch in a white dress sharp enough to belong in a magazine. Every inch of her seemed curated, sleek blonde hair, manicured hands, the faint scent of something expensive and citrusy. "Mrs. Carver," she said, smiling the way people do when they've practiced in a mirror. "You have the most charming little place." "Thank you," I said. "Come in." She stepped inside, scanning the living room, the old oak floors, the framed photo of Ethan in his high school baseball uniform, the worn armchair by the window. Her gaze lingered a second too long on the scuffed coffee table Thomas made from reclaimed barnwood. "I love how homey it feels," she said. "Ethan told me you still live here. I wasn't sure how much space you'd have." Her tone was light, but something in it tightened my throat. I poured coffee and tried to ignore how she looked at the chipped mugs, as if politeness required endurance. She talked about the wedding planner, the guest list, the weather forecast, everything except Ethan himself. "He's so lucky to have you," I said finally. She smiled without warmth. "I do my best to keep him focused. You know how men can be." The words floated between us, brittle and careful. I thought of the years I spent raising Ethan alone, working late at the estimating office, driving home past construction sites where the air smelled like sawdust and rain. Focus had never been Ethan's problem. When Kendra left an hour later, her perfume still hung in the kitchen like a memory I hadn't asked for. I stood by the window and watched her car glide away, the sunlight bouncing off its spotless glass. The house felt quieter after she was gone, though not peaceful like the air before a storm. I turned back to the counter, wiped away a ring of coffee, and saw the text still glowing on my phone screen. "We should go over a few things." I didn't know then that the things she wanted to go over would soon rewrite everything I thought I knew about my son, his wife, and the quiet life I'd built inside these walls. It was last spring when Ethan first brought Kendra home for dinner. The azaleas were blooming outside the porch, filling the evening air with that heavy Charleston sweetness that clings to your skin. I remember setting the table with the blue china I'd saved for special occasions. I'd cooked roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans from the farmer's market. Nothing fancy, just the kind of meal that had built our family. Ethan arrived first, looking proud and nervous at once. "Mom," he said, grinning, "wait till you meet her. You're going to love her." Kendra stepped through the door like she was entering a showroom. She wore a cream blazer over a silk blouse, and her heels clicked against the old floorboards. "Mrs. Carver," she said, extending her hand. "It's so lovely to finally see where Ethan grew up." Her voice was warm but practiced, the kind that sounds like it's used to being heard. I shook her hand and smiled. "Please, call me Lydia. I'm so glad you came." She took a slow look around the living room, her eyes tracing the ceiling beams Thomas had cut himself. The mismatched frames on the wall, the old couch with its soft edges. "It's got so much character," she said, "a kind of blue-collar charm. You can feel the history." Ethan laughed lightly, maybe too quickly. "Yeah, Mom's house is kind of like a time capsule. Nothing's changed since I was a kid." I felt something pinch inside me, but I only nodded. "That's true," I said. "Thomas built most of it with his hands. It's held up better than we expected." "Oh, that's amazing," Kendra replied, smiling. "You know, it's so rare to see people who still value that sort of craftsmanship. Where I grew up, we'd just call a contractor." The way she said people stuck with me. She didn't mean it cruelly, but there was a subtle distance in it, like she was admiring a world she'd never have to live in. At dinner, she complimented everything: the food, the dishes, even the salt shaker, but every word seemed to come with a gentle sting. "This meal tastes like home," she said, "the kind of thing you just can't get in the city anymore." Ethan smiled proudly at her, unaware of the tension. He talked about their new apartment in Atlanta, Kendra's job at the PR firm, their plans for the wedding. She talked about her clients, lawyers, tech startups, real estate developers, and the way she could turn even the dullest product into a story people believe. I listened and passed the potatoes. "Sounds like you're good at what you do," I said. Kendra beamed. "I try. It's all about image." "Really? People see what you show them." Something about that line stayed with me. After dessert, I offered coffee, but she declined too much caffeine, she said, gesturing at her watch. She had an early client meeting. When they left, Ethan hugged me tight, kissed my cheek, and promised to call. Kendra thanked me again for the home-cooked experience. When the door closed, the silence felt heavier than it should have. I cleared the plates one by one, the smell of rosemary and roasted chicken lingering in the air. On the counter, I noticed a faint ring from Kendra's wine glass, perfect circle, precise, unmoving. I wiped it clean, but the mark stayed faintly visible, like something pressed into memory. That night, lying in bed, I thought of how Thomas used to say that manners can hide more than rudeness ever could. Back then, I didn't know how true that would become. It was the first time I felt the quiet edge of something shifting, like the sound of a nail loosening in a wall you thought would never give. I never told Ethan much about money. When Thomas died, I inherited more than just his tools and his old truck. What he left behind were buildings, 3 of them at first. Modest medical offices near Broad Street that we'd bought when construction work was steady and the banks were kind. Over time, those 3 became 6, then 10. I learned how to negotiate leases, how to read zoning codes, how to listen without talking too much. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was solid. I didn't need to wear pearls or hold meetings in boardrooms. I just needed to know what people needed, how to fix what was broken, and when to stay silent. That last one turned out to be the most profitable skill of all. Every month, rent checks arrived with the same neat company logos printed at the top. Some were clinics, some law offices, and one, ironically enough, was Hayes plus Hartman PR. The firm where Kendra worked, they'd been tenants for nearly 4 years. I'd met their managing director once, a sharp woman named Susan Price, who told me she appreciated how low profile my company was. I told her I preferred things that way. Kendra had no idea, of course, and I intended to keep it that way. It wasn't that I wanted to deceive anyone. I just knew how people changed when money entered the room. Thomas used to say, wealth could turn a conversation into a mirror. People stop seeing you and start seeing what they want. I didn't want Ethan growing up thinking his life was cushioned by inheritance. I wanted him to know the weight of earning his own respect. So, when he told me he was moving to Atlanta, I offered to help him find a place, but he waved me off. We've got it covered. Mom, he said, Kendra's firm might even get a bonus next quarter. She's leading a big campaign for one of your old tenants. That clinic on Rutledge. I remember pausing at that. I knew exactly which clinic he meant. It rented the second floor of my building. I bit my tongue before asking too many questions. Instead, I smiled. That's wonderful. Tell her I hope it goes well. He grinned. She'll be thrilled you said that. I doubt she was. That evening, after they'd gone, I sat at my desk upstairs and opened the file drawer Thomas built himself. Inside were the property ledgers, tidy and unassuming. Each file bore a neat label: Rutledge Medical Center, Cypress Dental Group, Hayes plus Hartman PR. My handwriting looked smaller than I remembered. As if the years had made even my confidence quieter, I traced my finger along the folder marked with Kendra's firm. It felt strange, almost intimate, to hold the proof of something she didn't know that every morning when she walked into her office in her pressed suits and perfect heels. She was walking into one of my buildings. The thought didn't bring satisfaction. It brought an odd kind of distance. Like watching someone play a role in a story you wrote but never signed your name to. Keeping quiet had always been my way of surviving. Charleston could be polite to a fault, but it had a long memory for who came from money and who didn't. I'd seen men in tailored suits overlook my husband at city meetings, thinking he was just the builder, not the co-owner. I learned early that invisibility could be a kind of armor thin, but strong enough if you knew when to stay still. That habit followed me into widowhood, into business, and now into motherhood's second act. I didn't need Kendra or anyone to know what I owned. The truth didn't change just because it was hidden. What mattered was keeping Ethan's world intact, even if that meant staying small in the eyes of someone who needed to feel big. But some truths have a way of finding light when the wrong person strikes a match. I just didn't know yet how close that fire already was. Chapter 4. The Whisper from Harriet. It was a Wednesday afternoon when the call came. The sky outside was a flat gray, the kind Charleston wears before a storm, and I was sorting through rental statements at the kitchen table. Numbers had always been my comfort quiet. Obedient things that stayed where you put them. Lydia. The voice on the phone was warm, familiar, slightly hurried. It's Harriet Collins. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. Harriet and I had known each other for more than 20 years. She'd handled the accounting for a few of my tenants before she retired from full-time work. These days, she kept herself busy doing consulting for local firms, the kind that liked someone discreet to double-check their books. Never a bad time to hear from you, I said, smiling, though she couldn't see it. What's going on? There was a pause. Papers rustled on her end. I need to ask you something. And I'm not sure if it's my place, she began. You've got a lease with Hayes plus Hartman PR. Right. I straightened in my chair. Yes. They've been in one of my buildings for years. Why? Harriet hesitated. One of my new clients is a healthcare group, Briarwood Medical Partners. They've used Hayes plus Hartman for public relations. I've been reviewing expense reports, and there are some invoices that don't add up, duplicate charges, inflated vendor costs. It could just be sloppy bookkeeping, but it looks deliberate. I felt the first flicker of unease. And you're telling me this because one of the vendor names listed under their reimbursements is Broad Street Facilities Group. I went still. That was the holding name I used for my downtown properties, the same entity that owned the building where Kendra's firm operated. Harriet continued, lowering her voice as if someone might be listening. They've been charging Briarwood for on-site event space at your address. But I can't find any record of an actual event. It's billed 3 times over the last quarter. Pretty steep, too. The storm outside cracked softly. Thunder rolling over the harbor. I reached for the folder I'd left open on the table. You're sure it's my building positive? Harriet said. Your tax ID matches. I double-checked. For a moment. All I could hear was the sound of the refrigerator humming. My mind went to Kendra, her bright, easy smile. The way she talked about turning dull things into stories people believe. I remembered her mentioning a healthcare campaign, how proud she'd looked when she said she'd finally earned the trust of major clients. Harriet, I said quietly, who signed off on those invoices. Another pause. Kendra Hayes. Her name's on every one. The air in the kitchen seemed to thin. I pressed my palm against the table, steadying myself. Does Ethan know anything about this? I doubt it, Harriet replied gently. I didn't want to alarm you. But if this becomes a full audit, your name could show up as a payee. Even though you didn't do anything wrong, it might raise questions. I managed a small breath. Thank you for telling me. You're welcome, she said softly. Lydia, I know you're a straight arrow. I just thought you should be prepared. These things can get messy. After we hung up, I sat in silence. The phone still in my hand. Outside. Rain began to fall in long, deliberate strokes against the window. I turned to the file drawer and found the lease with Hayes plus Hartman terms clean. Payments always on time. No hint of trouble. But there it was, in black ink, tenant contact. Kendra Hayes. Managing account executive. I closed the folder slowly, feeling the quiet weight of it. For years, I'd chosen invisibility as protection. Now that same invisibility had become a doorway for someone else to use my name, my property, my trust. The rain deepened, drumming against the porch roof, steady and relentless. Somewhere between the thunderclaps, I realized that staying silent might no longer be harmless. It might soon mean complicity. Chapter 5. Choosing silence again. That night, the rain didn't stop. It drummed against the windows like a warning I couldn't decipher. I sat at the kitchen table long after the streetlights came on. The papers from Harriet spread out before me, their corners curling under the damp air. Kendra's signature glared up at me from the photocopy's smooth, confident strokes that almost looked proud. Thomas's old coffee mug sat beside them, the one with the chipped rim he never let me throw away. I reached for it without thinking, half expecting to feel the warmth of his hand still there. He used to say that the best thing about being underestimated was that people never saw you coming. But he also said something else. Softer, always after long days on site. Let your work speak louder than your words. Lid, noise doesn't build houses. I'd built my whole life on that truth. It had carried me through widowhood, through late nights calculating lease margins, through the quiet satisfaction of knowing who I was, even when no one else did. But now, the quiet felt heavier than before, like silence had changed shape. No longer a refuge, but a cage. I thought about calling Ethan. I even picked up the phone once. He'd been sending pictures all week Kendra's dress fitting. The rehearsal dinner venue, the waterfront terrace strung with lights. He sounded happy in every message, lighter than I'd heard him in years. He deserved that. I imagined his voice if I told him what Harriet had found. He'd defend Kendra at first, of course he would. He'd say it was a mistake, an accounting error, a misunderstanding. And even if he believed me, what then? The wedding was days away, my son's joy, my family's peace. It could all collapse before it began. I set the phone down. The house creaked around me, old wood shifting in the humidity. From the window, I could see the faint reflection of the photo wall, the one with Ethan's childhood pictures. Him with his first bike, his high school graduation, the day he helped Thomas lay the porch railing. He'd been 10, hammering nails beside his father, his hair plastered to his forehead from the heat. Thomas had watched him closely, patient but firm. Don't swing harder. Son, swing truer. That was the same day he'd said the line I never forgot. There's power in quiet. Lydia. People mistake it for weakness. But they're wrong. I'd believed that all my life. And for the most part, it had been true. But as I sat there with those forged invoices and that familiar signature, I couldn't help wondering if quiet power still counted when the wrong people spoke louder. By midnight, I'd packed the papers into a plain envelope and locked them in the desk drawer. I wasn't ready to destroy my son's world on a whisper. Not yet. I washed Thomas's mug, dried it carefully, and placed it back on the shelf. The rain had softened to a drizzle outside. Charleston lay under a thin film of fog, the kind that makes even the sharpest edges look merciful. I turned off the kitchen light and climbed the stairs, telling myself I'd wait until after the wedding, after Ethan said his vows, after peace had its moment before truth took it away. The rehearsal dinner was held at a restaurant overlooking the Ashley River, one of those polished places where the linen napkins smell faintly of starch and every glass of wine costs more than a week's groceries. The sunset outside was perfect, so perfect it almost felt staged. Boats drifted lazily along the water, their reflections trembling on the surface like something afraid to break. I arrived early, as I always did, old habits. I'd worn a navy dress and a string of pearls Thomas had given me on our 20th anniversary. The hostess led me to a long table on the terrace, already set for 20 guests. Silver cutlery glinted under the soft lights, and I could hear the low hum of laughter from the bar. Kendra and Ethan arrived a few minutes later. She was dazzling in a red silk dress, every movement practiced, every gesture deliberate. She greeted me with that same polished smile, the one that always felt rehearsed. "Mrs. Carver?" she said, brushing my cheek with air that never quite became a kiss. "You look lovely tonight." "Thank you, Kendra." "So do you." Ethan hugged me quickly, distracted, then turned to greet the guests following behind them, Kendra's co-workers, mostly, and a few of Ethan's friends from college. They were all city people, sleek and effortless, the kind who smiled with their teeth but not their eyes. Dinner began with champagne toasts and the kind of light conversation that dances on the surface of things. I sat at the far end of the table, beside an older man named Gerald, who worked at Kendra's firm. He was polite, asking about Charleston weather and golf courses, but his attention drifted back to the cluster of younger executives at the center. That was where the real orbit of attention revolved around Kendra, laughing, bright, magnetic. Halfway through the main course, I heard her voice rise lightly above the clatter of silverware. "You know," she said, smiling toward her colleagues. "Ethan's mom used to work in construction. Isn't that adorable?" The laughter came soft and reflexive, the kind that means nothing but still hurts. I set my fork down carefully. "Across the table," Ethan laughed, too nervously, quickly, as if to smooth the moment before it turned sharp. He didn't look at me. "Oh, not exactly," I said evenly. "I was an estimator, mostly. Worked with design teams and contractors. Not the tools themselves." Kendra tilted her head, pretending to be impressed. "Still, that's so hands-on. My dad used to say the world needs people who build things and people who tell their stories. I suppose we're the latter, aren't we?" She gestured to her colleagues, who nodded with practiced politeness. I smiled faintly. Every building tells its own story if you stay long enough to listen. For a moment, her smile faltered. Then the conversation shifted back to something safer: honeymoon destinations. Interior designers. The new campaign Kendra's firm had landed. I took a sip of water, feeling the coolness slide down my throat like something trying to steady me. When the waiter came by, I asked quietly for coffee. He nodded, grateful for a simple request amid all the noise. Ethan finally caught my eye. His expression uncertain, he mouthed, "You okay across the table?" I nodded. Of course I was okay. I had learned long ago that dignity didn't need witnesses. The rest of the dinner blurred together, dessert plates clinking. The photographer snapping candids, someone calling for a toast. Gerald stood to speak about success and love, and everyone raised their glasses. I lifted mine, too, the smile on my lips firm but weightless. When the party finally thinned, I helped the waitress gather empty plates. Kendra appeared beside me, her perfume sweet and sharp at once. "You don't have to do that," she said, laughing softly. "You're our guest." "I don't mind," I replied. "Old habits." She watched me for a moment, her head tilted slightly. "You're very humble. Lydia, that's something I've always admired." It sounded like a compliment, but something in her tone made it sting. Outside, the air had cooled. Ethan offered to walk me to my car, but Kendra touched his arm. "It's fine, babe. Your mom's only a few steps away. I told him not to worry." I'd parked just down the block. As I walked toward the lot, the sound of laughter floated behind me, echoing over the river. The streetlights caught the shimmer of the water, turning it silver. I paused for a moment, staring at the reflection, then at my own face in the car window. It looked calm enough composed, untouchable, but beneath the stillness, something small and sharp had begun to shift, the way a hairline crack moves quietly across glass before anyone sees it. The morning of the wedding broke clear and bright, the kind of Carolina blue sky that photographers pray for. The air smelled faintly of salt from the harbor, and church bells were ringing somewhere in the distance. I drove downtown early, long before the guests would arrive, and parked beneath the old oak trees lining East Bay Street. The Charleston Harbor Hotel stood tall against the water, glass catching the light in perfect angles. I had always liked that building. Thomas and I had bought it almost 10 years earlier when it was still a struggling boutique property. We'd renovated quietly, kept the staff, added a few new conference suites. I never changed the name. It was better that way, quiet investments, quiet returns. That morning, I walked through the lobby like any other guest, invisible among the bustle. No one knew that I owned the walls holding their laughter, the chandeliers that would later shimmer above their toasts. Inside the ballroom, florists were bent over vases, their hands dusted with pollen and ribbon fibers. I found myself helping them without thinking, snipping stems, adjusting roses, tightening ribbons. "These go by the windows," I told one of the girls softly, and she nodded, assuming I was part of the planning staff. Across the room, Kendra stood in the center of it all, clipboard in hand, headset gleaming against her sleek hair. She directed everything with corporate precision. No, the aisle runner needs to start 6 feet closer. And those candles, someone move them before the fire marshal arrives. Her voice carried easily over the music playing from someone's phone. Even the hotel manager, a man twice her age, nodded at her instructions. She looked radiant, confident, perfectly in control. When Ethan walked in a few minutes later, adjusting his cufflinks, she turned to him with a smile so polished it almost hurt to look at. "You look perfect," she said, straightening his tie. "Just remember, smile during the vows. We've got 3 cameras on you." He laughed nervously, kissed her forehead, and walked off toward the photographer. I watched the exchange from across the room, hidden behind a column of lilies. There was a certain poetry to it, my son marrying inside a building I owned but never claimed. I'd spent my life building things for other people, watching them step inside and make it theirs. That was the nature of creation. You let go of what you build. Still, I couldn't help but feel the irony settle in my chest. "Mrs. Carver," someone called. I turned to see the wedding coordinator hurrying toward me, clipboard clutched like a shield. "Could you help us with the family table seating? We're short on hands." I nodded, grateful for something to do. The name cards were neatly printed. Mr. and Mrs. Hayes, Dr. and Mrs. Berman, Ethan Carver, mother of the groom. My name was placed at the far end, near the musicians, a small detail, easily overlooked, but it landed with a quiet thud inside me. Perfect. Kendra said when she came over to inspect. "We'll keep things balanced that way." Her tone was sweet, almost professional. To the others, it probably sounded reasonable. To me, it was another small subtraction. By noon, the ballroom gleamed. The flowers were flawless, the candles aligned, the white chairs forming perfect rows. I stood by the window for a moment. Watching the harbor outside, the tide was high, calm and bright. A pelican drifted low over the water. The calm was deceptive. Somewhere beneath it, the current was shifting. Ethan came up beside me, buttoning his jacket. "You okay?" "Mom," he asked. "I'm fine," I said. "You nervous?" He smiled. "Only a little." "You sure you don't want to sit closer?" Kendra thought. I touched his sleeve gently. "This is your day. Sit me wherever you like." He nodded, kissed my cheek, and left to join the groomsmen. When I turned back to the window, Kendra was standing across the room, watching me. For just a second, her smile faltered, and something unreadable flickered in her eyes. Curiosity, maybe, or calculation. Then she turned and began directing the photographers again. Her voice bright, efficient, and sure. I gathered the leftover stems from the table and placed them in a glass of water. The petals trembled slightly in the air conditioning. Everything looked perfect. Too perfect. And perfection, I'd learned, rarely lasts. The ballroom glowed under hundreds of tiny gold lights, their reflections trembling in the glasses set neatly along the tables. The scent of roses mingled with champagne and salt from the harbor, drifting in through open doors. The string quartet played softly in the corner, while waiters carried trays of canapes and laughter rippled like background music. It was beautiful, too beautiful. The kind of perfection that hides something brittle underneath. Dinner had ended, plates were cleared, and people were relaxed, the way they always are when dessert and praise start blending together. I sat at my table near the edge of the dance floor, watching Ethan's hand rest gently on Kendra's back as she whispered something to a photographer. He looked happy, tired, proud. My heart squeezed in that strange way love does joy, tangled with something else that refuses to name itself. The DJ announced that the speeches would begin. Kendra took the microphone first. Of course. Her dress shimmered under the lights. Her posture was flawless, voice bright and polished. She spoke about gratitude, ambition, partnership, each sentence rehearsed and perfect. People smiled, nodded, raised their glasses at the right moments. Then she paused, her eyes sweeping over the guests before landing on me. And finally, she said, smiling sweetly, "I'd like to thank my husband's mom, Lydia, for showing me what not to become." There was a flicker of confusion, then a ripple of nervous laughter. Guests glanced at each other, uncertain if they'd misunderstood. Kendra's smile didn't waver. "No, really," she continued. "Lydia's humility is inspiring. She reminds us all that even without big careers or big voices, a woman can still find fulfillment. The laughter came again, softer this time, thinner. My son's face changed. He looked at her, then at me, his mouth opening slightly, but no words coming out. I felt every eye turn toward me. I lifted my champagne glass, smiled, and nodded once. The movement was slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial. I took a sip and set the glass down carefully on the white linen tablecloth. The sound of crystal meeting cloth was small, but it cut through the room like a bell. Kendra looked pleased with herself. She had the room. She thought she'd won. That was when I reached into my purse and pulled out the small leather folder I always carried. It wasn't large, just big enough to hold contracts. Receipts. The kind of papers people never notice until they matter. I stood, calm and unhurried. "Before your boss leaves," I said clearly, my voice steady and even. She might want to check her client reimbursements, specifically the ones billed to 48 Broad Street. The words hung in the air like the moment before glass breaks. At the far end of the room, a woman who had been seated with Kendra's colleagues turned sharply. She was in her 50s, hair silver at the temples. Wearing a tailored navy dress, I recognized her immediately. Susan Price, managing director at Hayes plus Hartman PR, Kendra's boss. The color drained from her face. "What did you just say?" she asked. I met her gaze. 48 Broad Street. "The event space charges listed under your healthcare client, Briarwood Medical Partners." For a long moment, no one moved. Susan set down her glass, eyes flicking toward Kendra. "Those were billed last quarter," she said slowly. "We never used that venue." Kendra's smile froze, brittle at the edges. "I think there must be a mix-up." Susan's voice hardened. "We'll discuss this later." The silence that followed was complete. The music had stopped. Even the servers froze mid-step, their trays hovering above the tables. I didn't move. My pulse was steady. Years of construction bids and contract disputes had taught me how to stand still while the floor shifted under everyone else. Susan looked back at me. "And you are Lydia Carver," I said quietly. "Owner of the building at 48 Broad Street." Her mouth parted slightly. Then she gave a small, professional nod. "I see." I sat back down. No one else spoke. Ethan's face was pale. Kendra's hand trembled as she set the microphone on the table. Someone coughed. Somewhere near the bar, a champagne cork popped too loudly, startling a few guests. The sound broke the tension, but only barely. "Congratulations again," I said softly, lifting my glass once more. "It's been a lovely evening." The applause that followed was hesitant, fragmented. Kendra laughed high, false, brittle, and said something about a funny misunderstanding, but the laughter didn't return. The energy in the room had changed completely. Ethan excused himself to the terrace, his face tight with confusion. Susan Price slipped out quietly a few minutes later. Phone in hand, Kendra stayed where she was, smiling at no one, her fingers tracing the stem of her glass over and over again. I watched her from my seat by the wall, still, unruffled. The air in the ballroom felt different now, thinner, sharper, honest. Sometimes all it takes is one quiet sentence to make people hear what they've been pretending not to. It took only seconds for the air in the ballroom to change. My single sentence had struck like a quiet storm, draining the laughter and leaving a charged stillness behind. At the main table, Susan Price's phone buzzed. She stepped away, speaking into it in her calm, clipped tone, every word sharpening her expression. Guests tried to keep smiling, but eyes drifted toward Kendra, whose painted composure was beginning to crack. She gripped her glass too tightly, her voice trembling as she forced small talk that no one returned. Ethan stood frozen by the dance floor, staring at us, his mother. his bride like a man suddenly realizing the ground beneath him wasn't solid. Susan returned, phone still in hand. "I just spoke with Briarwood's finance office," she said evenly. "Those invoices were billed to 48 Broad Street, totaling $22,000. Kendra's face went white. "That's a mistake," she said quickly. Someone must have Susan interrupted. "We also checked our database. The payments were processed last month under your authorization." Gasps moved through the tables. Kendra's co-workers looked away, studying their napkins, their glasses anywhere but her. Ethan's voice came low, uncertain. "Kendra, what is she talking about?" "It's a mix-up. She insisted." "I didn't handle those files directly." Susan's voice hardened. "Your initials are on every page." The silence that followed was brittle. Then the hotel manager, Richard West, approached with concern. "Is there a problem?" he asked. "Not with you," Susan said. "We're discussing a property, 48 Broad Street. You wouldn't happen to know the owner?" Richard looked between us, then nodded toward me. "That would be Mrs. Carver. She's owned it for years." Ethan blinked. "Mom, you..." Kendra turned sharply. "You own that building?" "Yes," I said quietly. "And several others downtown?" "Your firm rents from me, actually." A nervous laugh rippled from somewhere in the back. "Dying quickly." Kendra's voice cracked. "You planned this. You wanted to humiliate me." "No," I said evenly. "You did that yourself. I only corrected the truth." Across the room, Susan closed her phone with a snap. "Kendra," she said firmly, "I'll expect your ID and office keys Monday morning." Kendra's eyes filled. "You can't, Susan. Please." But Susan was already walking away. Whispers broke out. Fraud, termination, liability. Ethan turned toward me, searching. "Why didn't you ever tell me I wanted you to live freely?" I said, "without my name protecting you." He looked down, guilt and understanding mingling. Behind him, Kendra had sunk into her chair, mascara streaking, silence consuming her. The DJ had stopped the music. Even the waiters had frozen. Richard cleared his throat softly. "Mrs. Carver, can I help you already have?" I said. I looked around the room one last time. The harbor light spilled through the windows, soft and golden. Kendra sat still as stone, her empire of image collapsing in real time. Ethan didn't move to her. He just stood there, seeing the truth at last. As quiet and unstoppable as the tide, the music never came back on. After the revelation, the ballroom emptied faster than I expected. Laughter turned to murmurs, and murmurs to footsteps. Champagne flutes stood half full. Candles flickered, and the scent of lilies began to wilt under the heat of the lights. I stayed seated until most of the guests had gone. It felt only right to let the noise leave first. When I finally stood, I could feel the tremor of adrenaline fading from my hands. Ethan was nowhere in sight. Kendra, though, was still in the corner of the room, surrounded by the detritus of what had been her perfect evening silk hem, darkened by spilled wine. Lipstick smudged where her smile had cracked. She looked smaller somehow, not in stature, but in spirit, as if the walls that reflected her confidence had stopped believing her story. She followed me into the hallway without a word. Her heels clicked on the marble until she caught up beside me. "Lydia," she said, her voice hoarse. Please don't make this worse." I turned slowly. The hallway was quiet, except for the faint hum of the hotel's ventilation. "I'm not the one who did that." Tears welled in her eyes, breaking through the last of her poise. "I messed up. Those invoices, it wasn't supposed to go that far. I was under pressure." Susan kept demanding numbers that looked good on paper. "You forged them," I said simply. "You used my property's name. You dragged an innocent company into your deceit, and tonight You called me worthless in front of my son." Her lips trembled. "It was a joke, just a bad one." "It wasn't a joke." "Kendra," I took a slow breath, steady and even. "It was the truth you thought was safe to say out loud. You've been saying it in smaller ways for 2 years. You just ran out of smaller rooms." The silence between us stretched thin. She wiped her eyes, her mascara streaking into gray lines. "I'll lose everything," she whispered. "Please. Please don't let them press charges. Ethan won't, he can't." Before she could finish, Ethan's voice echoed from the end of the hallway. "Won't what?" He was standing there, hands clenched at his sides, face pale but set. He looked older in that moment, older and heartbreakingly uncertain. Kendra froze. "Ethan, I don't," he said quietly. "I heard enough." He looked at me next. "Mom, is it true? You own that building? You knew about this before the wedding." I nodded once. "I knew there was something wrong. I didn't want to ruin your day." He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "And she's been stealing from her clients." Kendra stepped forward. "It wasn't stealing. It was reallocation. I was going to fix it when the next quarter came through. It was temporary." "Stop," Ethan said, his voice cracking. "Just stop lying." She reached for him, but he stepped back. The movement was small, but final. For a moment, no one spoke. The air smelled faintly of roses and spilled champagne, bitter and sweet at once. "You know what hurts the most," he said finally, his voice low. "You made me feel ashamed of my own mother. You laughed when they mocked her. I thought it was harmless, but you made me part of it." Kendra's tears fell freely now. "Ethan, I love you." He shook his head. "Love doesn't look like this." I touched his arm gently. "Go get some air." I said, "You don't owe either of us anything right now." He hesitated, then nodded and walked away, his figure dissolving into the dim light of the lobby. Kendra turned back to me, shaking. "What are you going to do?" "Nothing more than I already have," I said quietly. "Your boss will decide what happens next. But remember something. Kendra respect isn't inherited by marriage. It's earned every day by how you treat the people who never needed to prove themselves to you." She stared at me as if the words had struck harder than anger ever could. Then she turned and walked back toward the ballroom, the sound of her heels echoing down the hall, lonely and uneven. When she was gone, I stepped outside. The night air was cool, the harbor lights flickering like stars that had fallen just close enough to see. The wind smelled of salt and magnolia. Behind me, the music equipment was being packed up. The last traces of celebration swept into bins. It was over. And for the first time in years, silence didn't feel like surrender. It felt like truth finally breathing. The house was silent when I returned. The clock on the mantel read 11:42 p.m., its steady tick the only sound. I hadn't realized how long I'd stayed by the harbor, trying to let the night air wash the noise of the wedding away. I slipped off my shoes, set my purse on the hall table, and reached for the kettle. The phone rang before the water even warmed. "Mrs. Carver," a woman's voice asked, low and composed. "This is Susan Price from Hayes plus Hartman PR." I exhaled slowly. "Yes, I expected your call. I hope it's not too late," she said. "Our legal and audit teams are already working. I need to confirm a few details about the invoices linked to 48 Broad Street." Her tone was clipped, professional, the kind that left no space for denial. "What do you need?" I asked. "Written verification that no Hayes plus Hartman or Briarwood Medical Partners events occurred on your property within the past year. I'll send documentation by morning," I said. Susan paused, her voice softening. "Thank you. Mrs. Carver, I'm sorry for what happened tonight. No one should be disrespected that way, least of all someone who's clearly built something solid." I never wanted it to become public. I said, I know, she replied. But truth doesn't stay buried forever. Good night. Mrs. Carver. When the call ended, the quiet returned different now. Not heavy, but alive. Humming with consequence. The rain had started again, tapping softly against the porch. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked. Ethan appeared in the doorway. Tie loose, eyes tired. Mom, he said, voice rough. I poured him tea without a word. He sat across from me, staring at his hands. Susan called me too, he said. They're putting Kendra on leave while the audit runs. If they find proof, there could be charges. I nodded. Paper trails don't lie. He swallowed. I should have seen it the way she chased appearances, how she treated people. You wanted to believe in her, I said gently. Love makes that easy. He looked up. You've been hiding all this, the buildings, the company. Why, so you could build your own life, I said. Your father and I built ours to give you freedom, not expectation. He studied the room, the framed photos, the quiet strength of a modest home. You didn't just give me freedom, he murmured. You gave me a foundation. I just never noticed. The clock ticked softly. Outside, thunder rolled faintly over the harbor. What happens now, he asked. Now, I said. The truth finishes what it started. He nodded, the fight leaving his shoulders. When he finally went upstairs, the house settled back into stillness. On the table, my phone glowed faintly in the dark like truth itself. Patient, waiting for dawn. By the next morning, the world had already moved faster than I expected. The news didn't make headlines, it didn't need to. In Kendra's world, rumors traveled quieter, sharper, through boardrooms and inboxes instead of newspapers. I woke to the soft chime of my phone. 3 new emails. The first was from Susan Price. Mrs. Carver, thank you for your cooperation. As of 9:00 a.m., Ms. Hayes has been suspended pending full investigation. We'll keep you informed should any legal review involve your properties. The second was from my property manager, confirming that he'd sent documentation showing no events were ever hosted at 48 Broad Street. The third was from an address I didn't recognize, Ethan's, but not his usual one. The subject line read simply, I'm sorry. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I went to the kitchen and started the coffee maker. The morning light slanted through the blinds, cutting across the wooden counter in thin, perfect lines. Outside, Charleston was already alive, the sound of car doors closing, dogs barking, the hum of weekday life pretending last night hadn't happened. When the coffee was ready, I sat at the table. The one Thomas had built decades ago. The wood was worn smooth from years of use. Everything about that table reminded me of endurance, of how things could survive without needing to shine. I finally opened Ethan's email. Mom, I don't know how to start. I'm ashamed that I stood beside her and let you be treated that way. I thought I was protecting peace, but I was just protecting my own comfort. I didn't want to see what she was becoming or what I was allowing. You didn't deserve any of it. I'm sorry for being blind. Love, E. The words blurred slightly as I read them. I didn't cry. Not exactly, but something loosened in me, a small, steady ache that had been waiting for release. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't even relief. Just the quiet understanding that sometimes justice doesn't feel like victory. It feels like loss finding its shape. Around noon, Ethan arrived. He looked tired, his eyes shadowed, his shoulders drawn inward like a man walking through aftermath. He carried no luggage, just a paper bag with pastries from the cafe near the marina. Thought you might not have eaten, he said softly. We sat together in silence. The clink of coffee cups the only sound between us. She's staying at her parents' place, he said eventually. Susan called this morning. The firm's freezing her accounts until the audit is complete. I nodded. That's the right thing to do. He stared into his mug. I don't know what to feel. She lied to everyone, but mostly to herself. I thought we were building a life together. Turns out, she was building a performance. People like Kendra survive on appearance, I said. They mistake polish for purpose. But underneath, it's always fragile. He looked up. And you're not angry, I was. I admitted, but anger's a waste of good energy. I'd rather spend it building something that lasts. He smiled faintly. That same boyish smile he used to have when Thomas taught him how to use a hammer. You always build things that last. We sat there a while longer, watching the light shift across the floor, every so often. A reflection from the window flashed on the table brief, soft, almost like glass catching its breath. By the time he left, the ache had settled into something quieter, steadier. I washed the coffee cups, placed them back on the shelf, and stood at the window, watching the harbor glint under the afternoon sun. The city went on as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But somewhere, inside the tall glass buildings downtown, an inbox carried a suspension notice with Kendra's name on it, and somewhere, she was reading it, realizing the sound of consequences was softer than she'd imagined. No applause. No drama. Just echoes through glass. By the second day, the story had become impossible to contain. It didn't break in the news. It spread the way all corporate scandals do through whispers. Meetings that start late, and emails marked urgent that no one wants to receive. I wasn't supposed to be involved anymore. But the truth has a way of pulling you back in. By mid-morning, Susan Price called again. Her voice was brisk. But beneath the professionalism, I could hear the fatigue. It's worse than we thought, she said. Much worse. Much. According to her, the audit had uncovered layers of falsification, duplicate invoices submitted under different vendor names, marketing reports billed to non-existent clients, and reimbursement requests signed by interns who didn't remember writing them. One of the interns, a quiet girl named Molly, had broken down during questioning. She admitted Kendra pressured her into approving expense sheets she didn't understand. She said it was just formatting. The girl had confessed. According to Susan, she said she'd fix it later. But later never came. By noon, Hayes plus Hartman's board had convened. Ethan had gone to the office with Susan to sit in as an observer, partly out of necessity, partly out of guilt. When he called me during their lunch break, his voice sounded hollow. They have proof. Mom, he said, everything. She used company funds to cover personal travel Bahamas, Paris, even a retreat at the Ritz-Carlton. It's all tied to those fake medical invoices. And the firm I asked, cutting ties completely. They're preparing to notify their clients. Susan said the board plans to make a statement tomorrow. He hesitated. She also said your name came up in the meeting. I froze. Mine. He sighed. They called you a woman of integrity. Said your calm response probably saved their reputation from further embarrassment. The board voted to send you a formal letter of thanks. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. The words landed softly, but they didn't feel triumphant. Gratitude wasn't what I wanted. I only wanted peace. Mom, Ethan said quietly, Kendra's losing everything. Her position, her license. Even her friends are turning away. She keeps saying you orchestrated this. I let out a slow breath. That's how people like her survive. They rewrite the story until they're the victim. But this time, the story wrote itself. He didn't respond. I could hear the hum of the office behind him, the muted rhythm of consequence taking shape. Later that evening, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea as the sun dipped low behind the trees. The cicadas had begun their restless chorus, rising and falling like a tide. Across the street, a neighbor watered her garden, her hose arching light through the air. Everything looked ordinary again, almost deceptively so. I thought of Kendra, of the way she'd stood at the microphone, so certain of her own shine. It wasn't malice that had destroyed her. It was entitlement. That quiet corrosion that eats through truth until nothing solid remains. The next morning, a courier arrived with a thick envelope embossed with the Hayes plus Hartman logo. Inside was a letter signed by the board. "We commend your discretion, professionalism, and integrity in the face of deception." I read it twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in a drawer. Some acknowledgments don't need display. Out in the distance, thunder rolled over the harbor, low and steady. The storm had already passed, but its echoes still traveled through the air like truth itself, moving long after the damage was done. By the third morning, the storm had burned itself out. Charleston woke under a washed sky, the air scrubbed clean, the streets damp and glistening. But peace didn't always mean calm. It just meant the noise had shifted somewhere quieter. The email came at 8:12 a.m. Ethan called less than 5 minutes later. I could hear the weight in his breath before he spoke. "It's official," he said. "They terminated her." I said nothing, just waited. "She got the notice at 7:30, he continued. "Susan hand-delivered it with HR. They asked for her badge and laptop. She didn't say a word, just nodded, packed her things, and left." I pictured it easily, Kendra in that glass office, her reflection caught in every surface she once commanded. The same glass that had magnified her brilliance now mirrored the cracks beneath it. "They're freezing her accounts pending restitution review," Ethan added quietly. "She might face charges if Briarwood decides to pursue fraud." "I see," I said. He exhaled, a sound between relief and exhaustion. "I went by the condo after. She wasn't there. Her mother was helping her pack." He stopped. "I told her I'd come for my things next week." The space between us stretched across the phone line like a sigh. I wanted to tell him that endings don't always roar. Sometimes they fade with the soft sound of doors closing, but I didn't. Some truths aren't meant to be softened. "She'll hate me," he said finally. "She'll hate both of us." "Maybe," I replied, "but hate has a short half-life. What lasts is the space it leaves behind." He didn't answer right away. Then, quietly, "Mom, I don't know how to thank you." I smiled faintly, though he couldn't see it. "Don't. Just learn from it." When we hung up, I stayed at the table, my hands wrapped around a cup gone cold. The kitchen smelled of rain drifting through the open window. The world outside went on delivery trucks rumbling past. A child calling to her dog. Life resuming its rhythm as if nothing had broken. On the counter sat the letter from Hayes plus Hartman, still folded, untouched since yesterday. I placed it in a drawer beside Thomas's old blueprints, the ones covered in pencil smudges and faint coffee rings. He would have understood all this. He'd known that justice. When it finally comes, never feels like victory. It feels like standing on a site after demolition necessary, but still a ruin. I walked out to the porch. The harbor shimmered in late light, gulls circling low over the water. Somewhere, Ethan was driving home, beginning again, somewhere else. Kendra was learning what silence feels like when it isn't chosen. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of magnolia through the air. I closed my eyes and let it pass over me. Not triumph, not peace, just stillness. The kind that comes after everything stops fighting. Ethan came home that evening just before sunset. The porch light hadn't yet flicked on, and the air held that soft gold between day and night. I was sitting on the steps with a glass of sweet tea, watching the tide pull against the dock across the street. He parked in front of the house and sat in his truck for a long minute before getting out. When he finally walked toward me, his movements were slow, careful, as though the ground might still give way beneath him. "Mind if I sit?" he asked quietly. I nodded toward the chair beside me. You live here too. He sat down, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on the porch railing Thomas had built years ago. It's strange, he said. I thought I'd feel angry or relieved, but mostly I just feel small. I let the quiet hold for a moment before I spoke. You don't have to feel small, just human. He looked at me then, eyes tired, voice low. I let her talk to you like that for months. I laughed at her jokes. I thought staying out of it meant keeping the peace, but it just made me a coward. You wanted to believe the best in her. I said, that's not cowardice. It's love, but it blinded me. He said, I saw how she treated you, how she looked down on what we came from, and I still thought she'd change once she had enough. I turned my glass slowly between my hands, the ice melting into pale gold. You can't protect people by pretending they're better than they are. It only teaches them to be worse. He nodded, his throat working to swallow the weight of it. I know. I just didn't want to lose her. You didn't lose her, I said softly. You lost the version you hoped existed. We sat in silence, watching the light fade until the first fireflies appeared above the lawn. He leaned back in his chair, shoulders easing a little. I don't deserve how patient you are, he said finally. I smiled faintly. Maybe not. But that's what family is. Grace you didn't earn, but still get to keep. The sky deepened into blue, the kind that holds both endings and beginnings. Ethan stayed beside me until the stars came out, saying nothing more, just breathing the same quiet air. Two people rebuilding something neither of them had meant to break. 2 weeks later, a journalist named Claire Henson called from the Charleston Ledger. Her voice was bright, professional, touched with curiosity. She said she was doing a feature on local entrepreneurs who'd shaped the city quietly, people who had built legacies without the noise of self-promotion. Someone from the Chamber of Commerce had given her my name. I understand you prefer privacy, she said. But the community could use a story like yours right now. Something about integrity that still stands. At first, I wanted to say no. I'd spent decades staying behind the curtain, letting the buildings speak for themselves. But something about the way she phrased it, the idea of standing for something, not just owning it, made me pause. We met at a cafe near the harbor, the same one where Thomas and I used to stop after site visits. She was young, no older than Ethan, with a notepad full of questions and a smile that said she'd already done her research. Why stay hidden all these years? She asked gently. Because noise doesn't build things. I said, work does. My husband believed that, and so do I. She smiled. And yet, your silence ended up speaking louder than most people's success stories. I looked out the window at the water, where sunlight danced over the ripples. Silence isn't weakness, I said. It's space. The room where choices echo before they become actions. When the article came out a week later, its headline read, The Quiet Builder of Charleston. It talked about the hidden strength behind ordinary lives, about how wealth means little without decency. Ethan brought a copy home and left it on the kitchen table. You're trending, he teased, half proud, half amused. I laughed softly. The sound surprised me. It had been a long time since laughter felt unguarded. Outside, the harbor breeze moved through the open windows, carrying the faint scent of rain and salt. For the first time, I didn't mind being seen. A year later, Charleston woke to another quiet morning. The sky was pale pink above the water, and the first sailboats were already drifting past the harbor, their sails catching the early light like soft wings. I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, the same chipped mug Thomas used to favor, and watched the world wake up in slow motion. The house felt different now, lighter. Ethan had remarried 3 months earlier to a woman named Julia, a school teacher with a gentle voice and the kind of warmth that filled a room without effort. She loved books, fresh flowers, and the sound of the piano even when no one played it well. At dinner, she always insisted on helping with dishes, and every time she left, she hugged me as though she'd known me all her life. They'd invited me to live closer to them, but I'd chosen to stay here by the water. This house held too much history to leave behind. Instead, they visited every Sunday, bringing laughter and stories that settled into the quiet like sunlight through lace curtains. The past had softened. Even Kendra's name, when it came up in brief mentions, no longer carried heat, only distance, the way a closed chapter sits quietly behind the next one. Ethan never gloated about her downfall, and I never asked. We both understood that survival doesn't need celebration. It only needs peace. On the table beside my tea sat a framed copy of the Charleston Ledger article. The headline read, "Strength doesn't need a microphone." I'd read it dozens of times, but that morning, it felt new again. Claire Henson, the young reporter, had written in her follow-up that legacy isn't built from noise, it's built from patience. From the courage to stand still when others shout. She'd called me a quiet force. I didn't feel like one. I just felt like myself. The sun climbed higher, turning the water to gold. A pelican glided low across the waves, dipping once before rising again. I sipped my tea, warm and steady, and let the silence settle around me, not empty this time, but full of everything I'd learned to hold. The storm was long gone. What remained was mine.